Mark Wilson, a struggling Montana farmer, risks everything to save a lost boy Eli from a brutal snowstorm. Facing foreclosure and town suspicion, Mark shelters the silent child, only to be met with accusations and isolation. As whispers turn to blame, the bank seizes his farm and Eli is taken away. Yet a mysterious note hints at unseen allies. With military jeeps closing in at dawn, the truth behind Eli's identity unravels, pulling Mark into a dangerous web of secrets. Will his kindness be his salvation or his undoing? The stakes are higher than anyone imagined. If Mark's story of courage and kindness moved you, join us to uncover more tales of unsung heroes. Subscribe to QH, share your own stories of doing what's right, and help us shine a light on those who refuse to walk away. Your support keeps these stories alive. Mark Wilson's heart pounded with a fierce resolve as he stared into the swirling chaos of the snowstorm. The wind howled like a wounded animal, biting at his weathered face, but he refused to turn back. Somewhere out there, lost in the frozen wilderness of rural Montana, a child's desperate cries pierced the air. The sound tugged at something deep inside him, a father's instinct, a protector's duty. He couldn't let that boy die alone in the cold. His heavy boots sank into the snow, each step a battle against the icy mud that clung to him like despair itself. The forest loomed ahead, its skeletal trees barely visible through the blinding white veil, but Mark pressed forward, driven by a stubborn hope that refused to flicker out. At 44, Mark was no stranger to hardship. The wheat farm he called home had been in his family for generations, its fields a testament to their sweat and dreams. But the past 3 years had been a relentless siege. Losing his wife, Emily, to a sudden illness had left a gaping wound in his soul, one that ached every time he looked at their 10-year-old son, Jason. Raising the boy alone on this sprawling, unforgiving land was a daily act of defiance against grief. This winter, though, had tested him beyond measure. An early frost had crept in like a thief, claiming half his crop before it could ripen. Equipment failures followed, each repair draining the meager savings he'd clung to like a lifeline. The bank's letters had arrived with cruel regularity, their cold, formal words warning of foreclosure. The latest, the third, gave him just 14 days to salvage his life's work. Yet, as he trudged through the storm, none of that mattered. A child was out there, and Mark would not abandon him. Through the haze of snow, he spotted a flicker of movement at the forest's edge. A small, stumbling figure, no bigger than Jason. Mark's breath caught as he drew closer, his heart twisting at the sight of a boy, barely 7 years old, shivering and disoriented. The child's clothes were tattered, hanging off his frail frame like rags, his face streaked with dirt and frozen tears. His wide, frightened eyes met Mark's, and for a moment the world seemed to still. "Hey, little guy," Mark said softly, crouching to the boy's level, his voice steady despite the storm raging around them. "What's your name?" The child only stared, his gaze hollow, as if the cold had stolen his voice along with his warmth. Mark's chest tightened with a mix of pity and urgency. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy coat, wrapping it around the boy's trembling shoulders. "You're freezing out here. Let's get you somewhere warm, okay?" Scooping the boy into his arms, Mark felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like the snow blanketing the ground. The child was light, too light, and his silence gnawed at Mark's nerves as he carried him back to the farmhouse. The journey felt endless, each step a fight against the wind's relentless push. But Mark's thoughts were a whirlwind of worry and determination. Who was this boy? Where were his parents? How had he ended up alone in the forest during a blizzard? The questions churned in his mind, but he shoved them aside. Right now, the boy needed warmth, food, and safety. Everything else could wait. Inside the farmhouse, the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards grounded Mark as he set the boy down near the wood stove. The fire crackled, casting a soft glow over the room, and Mark stoked it with care, coaxing the flames higher to chase away the chill. He moved with purpose, his hands steady despite the exhaustion creeping into his bones. In the kitchen, he warmed a pot of vegetable soup, the savory aroma filling the air as he glanced at the boy, who sat huddled in his coat, still silent. Jason, curious and cautious, peered from the doorway, his dark eyes flickering between his father and the stranger. Mark caught his son's gaze and offered a reassuring nod. "He's going to be okay, Jason," he said, though the words felt more like a prayer than a promise. Jason hesitated, then stepped forward, clutching a pair of his old pajamas and a worn stuffed bear, a relic from his own younger years, when Emily's laughter still filled the house. "Here," Jason said quietly, holding out the items to the boy. His voice was shy but kind, a reflection of the gentle heart he'd inherited from his mother. The stranger's eyes softened, and he accepted the offerings with trembling hands. Mark's throat tightened as he watched the exchange, a swell of pride mixing with the ache of loss. "We'll find your folks tomorrow," he told the boy, kneeling beside him as he tucked a blanket around his small frame. "You're safe here tonight." The child's eyelids fluttered, exhaustion finally overtaking fear, and he drifted to sleep on the makeshift bed Mark had set up beside Jason's. As the night deepened, Mark sat by the stove, the fire's glow casting long shadows across the room. His mind raced, replaying the day's events. The boy's haunted eyes, the storm's fury, the looming threat of the bank's deadline. It all pressed down on him, heavy as the snow piling up outside. He thought of Emily, of how she'd always believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. "Kindness is never wasted," she'd said once, her voice soft but certain. Mark clung to those words now, letting them anchor him as he faced an uncertain tomorrow. At dawn, the storm had quieted, leaving a world blanketed in white. Mark called the sheriff's office, his voice steady as he explained the situation. 2 hours later, Deputy Collins arrived, his boots crunching on the fresh snow. The man's sharp eyes scanned the farmhouse, lingering on the boy with a suspicion that made Mark's stomach twist. "You found him yesterday evening," Collins said, his tone clipped, pen hovering over his notepad. "Why didn't you call us right away?" Mark straightened, meeting the deputy's gaze. It was nearly dark, and the roads were a mess. The kid was half frozen, needed food and warmth. I wasn't about to drag him back out into that storm. His words were calm but firm, though inside, a flicker of anger stirred. Did they think he'd meant the harm? Collins scribbled notes, his expression unreadable. He snapped photos of the boy, who still hadn't spoken, his small face pale against the blanket. The deputy's radio crackled, and a voice from dispatch cut through the quiet. "No missing children reports match his description. We'll need to take him in for evaluation." Collins's tone was flat, professional, but it carried an edge that set Mark's nerves on edge. "I'll need a full statement from you, Wilson." Mark nodded, his jaw tight. He watched as the deputy led the boy to the patrol car, a pang of loss hitting him as the child glanced back, eyes wide with uncertainty. By afternoon, whispers had slithered through the small town, carried on the wind like the snow itself. Mark Wilson, that odd widower, had been hiding a kid on his farm, always kept to himself since his wife passed. Probably can't even handle his own boy, let alone some stray. The rumors stung, each one a sharp jab at the life Mark had fought to hold together. He'd heard the gossip before, how people pitied him, questioned his ability to raise Jason alone. But this was different, uglier, twisting his act of compassion into something sinister. The next morning, as the sun rose over the frost-covered fields, a new blow landed. A bank representative arrived, flanked by the sheriff himself. The banker's face was a mask of cold efficiency as he delivered the news. "Mr. Wilson, in light of recent events and your loan status, we're accelerating the foreclosure process. Your presence here raises community concerns." Mark's blood ran hot, his voice rising despite himself. "Community concerns? I saved a kid who would have died out there." The words burst out, raw with frustration and disbelief. The banker's eyes didn't waver. "That's for the authorities to decide. You have 72 hours to vacate." Mark stood in his yard, the weight of the words crushing him as he watched the sheriff's car drive away, the boy's small face barely visible through the window. The farm, his home, his family's legacy, it was slipping through his fingers, and with it, the life he'd fought to preserve for Jason. As 6 military jeeps rolled up, their engines shattering the morning's fragile silence, Mark's heart sank. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than him, bigger than the farm, but in that moment he thought of the boy, safe and warm because of him. And Emily's words echoed again. "Kindness is never wasted." He held on to that truth, even as the world he knew crumbled around him. Mark's calloused hands gripped the steering wheel of the old county vehicle. The engines hummed a faint comfort against the howling wind outside. The snow had come down hard that night, blanketing the fields in a merciless white shroud. He'd found the boy, small, shivering, half buried in a drift just off the county road, alone in the kind of cold that could steal a life in minutes. Mark hadn't hesitated. He'd scooped the child up, wrapped him in his own coat, and driven him back to the farmhouse. His heart had pounded with a mix of fear and resolve, the boy's shallow breaths urging him to move faster. He didn't know who the child was or how he'd ended up there, but Mark knew one thing. No one deserved to be left in that frozen wilderness. In the days that followed, the town of Milwood turned on him. No one asked why he'd taken the boy in, why he'd risked his own safety to save a stranger. They didn't see the way Mark had stayed up through the night, stoking the fire, watching the boy's pale face for signs of recovery. They didn't see the quiet relief in his chest when the child finally opened his eyes, wide and frightened, but alive. Instead, they saw only a struggling farmer, isolated on a patch of land too far from town, a man who kept to himself more than they liked. To them, Mark was an easy target, a convenient suspect in a story they'd already written in their minds. Jason, his 8-year-old son, clung to his hand as they walked through Milwood's main street, his small fingers trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of the townsfolk's stares. "Dad," he whispered, his voice small and uncertain, "why are they mad at you for helping?" Mark's heart twisted. He wanted to shield Jason from the cruelty of suspicion, from the way people could turn on you for doing what was right. He crouched down, meeting his son's wide, searching eyes, and forced a smile. "Some folks don't understand, buddy," he said softly, though the words felt hollow. He had no real answer, no way to explain why kindness had become a crime in their eyes. Inside, a quiet anger simmered, not at Jason, never at Jason, Isham, but at the town that had once been his home, now a place that felt like it was closing in around him. Milwood's rejection was subtle but relentless. At the hardware store, Old Man Carter, who'd known Mark since he was a boy, suddenly claimed he was out of the nails and wire Mark needed to fix the barn roof. His eyes wouldn't meet Mark's, darting instead to the floor, as if Mark's very presence was an inconvenience. At the diner where Mark and Jason used to share milkshakes on slow Saturday afternoons, the waitress gave a tight-lipped smile and said no tables were free, though empty booths stood in plain sight. Even the school principal, Mrs. Hargrove, pulled Mark aside one morning, her voice dripping with false concern. "Maybe Jason should stay home for a few days," she suggested, adjusting her glasses. "Just until this situation is clearer." Mark's jaw tightened, but he nodded, not trusting himself to speak without letting his frustration spill over. Jason deserved better than to be caught in the crossfire of adult mistrust. The sting of betrayal cut deepest with Frank, a neighbor who'd borrowed Mark's tractor last harvest and shared beers on the porch afterward, laughing about the stubbornness of their old machinery. Now Frank crossed the street to avoid him, his shoulders hunched as if Mark's gaze carried a curse. "Frank!" Mark called out one chilly morning, his voice rough with desperation. "You know me. I've lived here my whole life. I did what anyone would have done, saved a kid who was freezing to death." Frank stopped, his boots scuffing the pavement, but he wouldn't look up. "Maybe you should have just called it in, Mark," he muttered. "Left it to the professionals." Mark's chest tightened, a mix of disbelief and fury rising in his throat. "And let a child freeze for 40 minutes while they drove out here in a blizzard?" he shot back. Frank said nothing, just turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing alone, the cold seeping deeper than the weather ever could. The boy, identified only as Eli in the local papers, had been taken to Horizon Children's Center 2 counties away. No family came forward to claim him, no one to explain why a child had been alone in the woods during a storm. Eli was silent, his world reduced to nods and head shakes, as if words were too heavy to carry. Mark couldn't stop thinking about him, picturing the boy's wide eyes, the way he'd clung to the blanket Mark had given him. He wondered what Eli had been through, what had left him so quiet, so guarded. A week later, the news hit like a punch to the gut. Eli was missing from the center. The Milwood Gazette's headline screamed, "Child previously held at suspicious farm now missing again." The words were a blade twisting in Mark's chest. The insinuation was clear. Mark was to blame, his act of kindness now painted as something sinister. The sheriff's office called him in for more questioning. Mark sat across from Detective Hargreaves, his hands folded calmly on the table, though inside a storm of anger and exhaustion raged. He'd repeated his story so many times it felt like a script, each word worn thin from overuse. "I found a child alone in freezing conditions," he said, his voice steady despite the fire in his veins. "I brought him to safety, fed him, kept him warm, and called the authorities as soon as the roads were clear. That's all that happened." The detective leaned forward, his eyes narrow with skepticism. "Then why would he run away from proper care?" he asked, as if Mark had the answer to Eli's pain. Mark's hands clenched briefly, then relaxed. "Maybe because he was scared," he said quietly. "Maybe because strangers took him from the only place he felt safe since whatever happened to him in those woods." His words hung in the air, but the detective's expression didn't soften. They saw what they wanted to see: a man drowning in debt, clinging to a farm he could barely afford, a man who must have had some ulterior motive. That night, with eviction looming just one day away, Mark and Jason slept in the barn. The house was already packed, the electricity cut off, leaving them with nothing but the faint warmth of the livestock and a pile of wool blankets. Jason curled against his father, his small body trembling in the dark. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "will we ever come back home?" Mark's throat tightened, the weight of his son's question pressing against his heart. He stroked Jason's hair, each touch a silent promise to protect him, even when he felt powerless. "I don't know, buddy," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "It's not fair. You're right, I always told you helping is the right thing. And it is. Always. Even when it costs you everything. Even if it costs us our farm." He swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. The farm was more than land. It was his father's legacy, the place where he'd taught Jason to plant seeds, to fix fences, to believe in doing right no matter what. Losing it felt like losing a piece of his soul. Before dawn, a sound broke the stillness, footsteps crunching through the frost-covered grass outside the barn. Mark's heart raced, a mix of hope and fear surging through him. He eased the barn door open, the cold air biting at his face, and found an envelope lying on the ground. His hands shook as he picked it up, the weight of it heavier than paper should be. Inside was a handwritten note, the words precise and unfamiliar. "Thank you for saving my nephew's life. We cannot come forward yet, but know you are not alone. Help is coming." No signature, no clue to its sender. Mark read it twice, his mind racing. Was it a cruel prank, designed to toy with his fading hope? Or was it genuine, a lifeline thrown from the shadows? Something about the careful, deliberate handwriting made him pause, a flicker of belief stirring in his chest. He tucked the note into his pocket, its words a fragile thread of hope in a world that had turned against him. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Mark Wilson stood beside his weathered pickup truck, carefully stacking the last of his family's belongings into the bed. The air was heavy with the scent of dew-soaked earth, a familiar comfort that now felt like a cruel reminder of what he was leaving behind. His calloused hands paused on a cardboard box filled with old photo albums, each one a snapshot of a life rooted in this land. He glanced up, catching the subtle twitch of curtains in the windows of neighboring houses. His neighbors' eyes, hidden in the shadows, weren't filled with malice, but with something more piercing: shame. Not a single one had offered a hand to help him pack. Not one had spoken up when whispers of scandal first began to swirl, branding him an outcast in the very community where his family had tilled the soil for 3 generations. The sting of their silence cut deeper than any accusation. Mark's chest tightened as he thought about the years spent here, the memories woven into every inch of this farm. He could still hear the echo of his son Jason's laughter as he wobbled on his first bicycle, Mark jogging alongside, steadying the handlebars with a proud grin. He saw the apple tree his wife Sarah had planted in the front yard, its branches now heavy with fruit she'd never see ripen. She'd been gone 3 years, but her absence still ached like a bruise that never healed. The fields stretched out before him, silent witnesses to decades of his family's sweat and dreams. Each furrow in the earth seemed to hold a piece of their story. His grandfather's stubborn determination, his father's quiet resilience, and his own hopes for Jason's future. Now it was all slipping away, stolen by rumors he couldn't outrun. Jason emerged from the farmhouse, his small frame weighed down by a backpack stuffed with his most treasured possessions: a worn baseball glove, a dog-eared comic book, a photo of his mother. At 12, he was too young to carry such a burden, but his eyes held a quiet strength that made Mark's heart swell and break all at once. The boy climbed into the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the dashboard, as if afraid to look back at the only home he'd ever known. Mark took one final glance at the farm, his throat tight with unspoken grief. "Time to go, son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with the weight of all they were leaving behind. The sky was just beginning to blush with the colors of dawn when a low, ominous rumble broke the stillness. Mark froze, his hand on the truck's door handle. The sound wasn't the familiar hum of a neighbor's car or the sputter of a tractor. It was deeper, more deliberate, like the growl of something predatory. Stepping out from the barn where they'd spent their last night, he squinted toward the access road. Dust clouds rose in the distance, swirling like specters under the faint morning light. 6 camouflage-painted Jeeps tore through the gate, their tires chewing up the gravel as they formed a precise semicircle around the barnyard. The vehicle's insignia were unfamiliar, not the standard markings of the Army or National Guard, but something colder, more secretive. Mark's pulse quickened, a mix of fear and defiance surging through him. Neighbors began to spill out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. They stood at a cautious distance, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. The sheriff's patrol car rolled up moments later, its lights flashing but silent. Sheriff Daniels stepped out, his brow furrowed in confusion, clearly as blindsided as everyone else. Mark positioned himself in front of the barn door, where Jason still slept, oblivious to the chaos unfolding. His hands raised slightly, palms open, a gesture caught between surrender and readiness. Was this an arrest? Or something worse? His mind raced, replaying the accusations that had driven them to this moment, the whispers that had turned friends into strangers. The lead Jeep's door swung open, and a man in tactical gear stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. He carried himself with an air of unquestionable authority, though no rank was visible on his uniform. His eyes locked onto Mark's, steady and unyielding. "Mr. Wilson," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I'm Commander Hayes. We're here to secure your safety." The words hit Mark like a jolt, their meaning elusive. Safety? From what? Before he could respond, another door opened, and a small figure leapt down from one of the Jeeps. Mark's breath caught. It was Eli, the boy he'd found wandering, battered and scared, in the woods 3 weeks ago. Behind him came a tall man in civilian clothes, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings with a predator's focus. "I don't understand," Mark said, his voice rough with confusion and exhaustion. He felt the weight of every sleepless night, every sidelong glance from neighbors, every moment of doubt that had gnawed at him since he'd done what he thought was right. Commander Hayes lowered his voice, stepping closer to avoid the ears of the growing crowd. "The child you found is Elias Thornon. His father is Special Agent Robert Thornon, one of our most critical undercover operatives working to dismantle an international weapons trafficking network." The man in civilian clothes, Agent Thornon, Mark assumed, approached, keeping Eli close to his side. The boy's eyes were wide, a mix of relief and lingering fear, as he clung to his father's hand. "3 weeks ago," Thornon began, his voice steady but laced with a raw edge, "our safe house was compromised. During the extraction, Eli and I were separated. I thought—" His words faltered, and for a moment the stoic mask of a seasoned operative cracked, revealing a father's anguish. "I thought I had lost him, until you stepped in and confirmed he was alive." Mark's mind reeled, piecing together fragments of the past weeks. The boy he'd found, shivering and alone, had been no ordinary runaway. But why the secrecy? "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" he asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "Why let my life fall apart?" Thornon's jaw tightened, but his gaze didn't waver. "The operation is still active. If we'd made contact sooner, it could have exposed our work. putting dozens of lives at risk. Years of infiltration down the drain. We had to keep our distance while we secured the situation. Commander Hayes stepped in, his tone measured but firm. Your intervention saved this boy's life, Mr. Wilson, but it also put you in the crosshairs. The people hunting Agent Thorne don't hesitate to eliminate anyone who might know too much. That includes you. Mark's fists clenched, bitterness rising like bile. So you let me lose everything? My home, my reputation, my son's future? The words spilled out, raw and unfiltered, carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every whispered rumor, every door that had closed in his face. He thought of Jason asleep in the barn, unaware of how their world had been upended by a single act of compassion. No, Thornton said, his voice resolute, cutting through Mark's anger. We've been watching, planning. What you've endured, the suspicion, the isolation, was the cost of your kindness in a world that doesn't always reward it. But we're here now to make this right. As dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges, Mark Wilson stood beside his old pickup truck, its bed piled high with the remnants of a life he'd built over decades. Each box he loaded carried more than possessions. They held memories, dreams, and the weight of a legacy now slipping through his fingers. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, a smell that once brought comfort but now felt like a betrayal. His hands, rough from years of working the land, lingered on a boxes of photo albums, each picture a frozen moment of joy now tinged with sorrow. Across the street, curtains twitched in the windows of neighboring houses. The eyes behind them didn't burn with hatred, but with something sharper, shame. Not one neighbor had offered to help him pack. Not one had defended him when whispers of scandal began to spread, poisoning the community where his family had farmed for 3 generations. Their silence stung like a fresh wound, a reminder that trust, once broken, was hard to mend. Mark's heart ached as he surveyed the farm, its fields stretching out like pages of a book he'd spent his life writing. He could still see Jason, his 12-year-old son, wobbling on his first bicycle, his laughter ringing out as Mark steadied the handlebars with a grin that felt like it could light up the world. He saw the apple tree his wife Sarah had planted with such care, its branches now laden with fruit she'd never taste. 3 years after her death, her absence was a quiet ache that never faded, a shadow that followed him through every task. The soil beneath his feet held the footprints of his grandfather's stubborn resolve, his father's quiet strength, and his own hopes for Jason's future. Now those hopes were crumbling, swept away by rumors he couldn't escape. Jason stepped out of the farmhouse, his small frame dwarfed by a backpack stuffed with his most precious belongings. A well-loved baseball glove, a comic book worn thin at the edges, a faded photo of his mother. His young face was set with a determination that broke Mark's heart, a resilience no child should need. Jason climbed into the truck, his eyes fixed on the dashboard, as if looking back at the farm would be too much to bear. Mark took one last look at the land, his throat tight with grief for all they were losing. "Time to go, son," he said, his voice soft but heavy with the weight of their departure. The first rays of dawn were just breaking when a low, menacing rumble shattered the quiet. Mark froze, his hand on the truck's door handle, his pulse quickening. The sound wasn't the familiar purr of a neighbor's car. It was deeper, more deliberate, like the growl of something dangerous approaching. Stepping out from the barn where they'd spent their final night, he peered down the access road. Dust clouds rose like ghosts in the pale light, and 6 camouflage-painted jeeps roared through the gate, their tires tearing into the gravel. They arranged themselves in a precise semicircle around the barnyard, their unfamiliar insignia glinting in the dawn. These weren't Army or National Guard vehicles. Something about them felt colder, more clandestine. Mark's stomach churned with a mix of fear and defiance. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. The sheriff's car pulled up moments later, its lights flashing silently. Sheriff Daniels stepped out, his expression as bewildered as the crowd's. Mark planted himself in front of the barn door, where Jason still slept, unaware of the storm brewing outside. His hands rose slightly, palms open, caught between surrender and readiness to protect his son. Was this an arrest, or something far worse? His mind raced, replaying the accusations that had upended their lives, the whispers that had turned lifelong friends into strangers. The lead jeep's door opened, and a man in tactical gear stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. He moved with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed, though no rank adorned his uniform. His eyes met Mark's, steady and unyielding. "Mer Wilson," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "I'm Commander Hayes. We're here to secure your safety." The words landed like a shockwave, their meaning slipping through Mark's grasp. Safety? From what? Before he could respond, another door opened, and a small figure leapt from one of the jeeps. Mark's breath caught. It was Eli, the boy he'd found 3 weeks ago, bruised and terrified in the woods. Behind him came a tall man in civilian clothes, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings like a hawk. "I don't understand," Mark said, his voice rough with exhaustion and confusion. The weight of the past weeks pressed down on him. Every sleepless night, every suspicious glance, every moment of doubt that had eaten away at his resolve. Commander Hayes stepped closer, his voice low to keep the growing crowd from hearing. "The child you found is Elias Thornon. His father is Special Agent Robert Thornon, one of our most vital undercover operatives working to dismantle an international weapons trafficking network." The man in civilian clothes, Agent Thornon, Mark assumed, approached, keeping Eli close. The boy's eyes were wide, a mix of relief and lingering fear, as he gripped his father's hand. "3 weeks ago," Thornon began, his voice steady but carrying a raw undercurrent, "our safe house was attacked. During the extraction, Eli and I were separated. I thought—" His voice broke, and for a moment, the mask of a seasoned operative fell away, revealing a father's raw pain. "I thought I'd lost him forever. Until you found him and proved he was still alive." Mark's mind spun, piecing together the fragments of the past weeks. The boy he'd rescued wasn't just a runaway. He was the key to something far bigger. But the secrecy gnawed at him. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" he asked, his voice sharp with frustration. "Why let my life fall apart?" Thornon's jaw tightened, but his gaze held steady. "The operation is still ongoing. Contacting you earlier could have exposed our work, putting countless lives at risk, years of infiltration undone. We had to stay back while we secured the situation." Commander Hayes stepped in, his tone firm, but not unkind. "Your actions saved this boy's life, Mr. Wilson. But they also made you a target. The people hunting Agent Thornon don't hesitate to eliminate anyone who might know too much. That includes you." Mark's fists clenched, a surge of bitterness rising within him. "So you let me lose everything? My home, my name, my son's future?" The words poured out raw and unfiltered, carrying the pain of every whispered rumor, every door slammed in his face, every night spent wondering if he'd done the right thing. "No," Thornon said, his voice cutting through Mark's anger like a blade. "We've been watching, preparing. The suspicion, the isolation you've faced, it was the cost of your kindness in a world that doesn't always value it. But we're here now to make this right." Mark Wilson stood on the frost-covered porch of his weathered farmhouse, the early morning chill seeping into his bones. His calloused hands gripped the railing, his knuckles whitening as he stared out at the fields he'd toiled over for decades. The threat of foreclosure loomed like a storm cloud, a relentless weight that pressed against his chest. He'd always been a man of few words, but the silence within him now was heavier, born of betrayal from a town that had once called him neighbor. The accusations, wild, baseless claims of his involvement in something sinister, had turned lifelong friends into strangers. Yet, despite the whispers and sidelong glances, Mark had done what he always did. He kept going, one foot in front of the other, because the land demanded it, and so did his son, Jason. As dawn broke, the rumble of military vehicles shattered the quiet. Mark's heart stuttered, a mix of confusion and dread knotting his stomach. He squinted into the rising sun, watching as a convoy of Humvees rolled up the dirt path to his farm. Soldiers spilled out, their movements precise, their faces unreadable. At their helm was Agent Hayes, a man whose sharp eyes and clipped tone carried the weight of authority. Mark's first thought was that they'd come to take the farm, to strip away the last piece of his identity. But Hayes's words cut through that fear like a blade through fog. Mr. Wilson, Hayes said, his voice steady but laced with something Mark couldn't quite place, respect, perhaps, or gratitude. This nation doesn't always recognize its heroes, but we don't abandon our own, nor those who shield them. He gestured to the soldiers who were already fanning out across the property, setting up a perimeter with practiced efficiency. Mark's breath caught it as Hayes continued, explaining that, as of 0600 hours, the farm was now a temporary safe house under military protection. The foreclosure, that suffocating noose around Mark's future, had been suspended, pending a national security review. A female officer approached, her boots crunching on the frozen ground, and handed Mark a stack of documents adorned with government seals. "Your financial burdens have been addressed," she said softly, "through a confidential compensation package for your service to national security." Mark's mind reeled, his thoughts a tangle of disbelief and cautious hope. Service? He was just a farmer, a man who had spent his life coaxing life from stubborn soil. What service could he have rendered? Before he could ask, Jason emerged from the barn, his teenage frame lanky and hesitant, his eyes widening at the sight of armed soldiers staking out their land. The boy's confusion mirrored Mark's, but there was something else in Jason's expression. Pride, maybe, or the flicker of relief that his father wasn't the villain the town had painted him to be. From the chaos of the morning, a small figure broke free. Eli, the boy Mark had found half frozen in a blizzard weeks ago, ran toward Jason, his face splitting into a grin that seemed to light up the gray dawn. Mark's heart clenched at the sight. He'd carried Eli through the snow, the boy's frail body trembling against his chest, his own coat barely enough to shield them both from the storm's bite. He hadn't asked questions then, hadn't demanded answers from a child too traumatized to speak. He'd simply brought him inside, set him by the fire, and given him Jason's old clothes, the ones his son had outgrown but Mark couldn't bear to throw away. That act, so simple yet so instinctive, had changed everything. Sheriff Davis pushed through the growing crowd, his badge glinting under the weak sunlight, his voice sharp with indignation. "What the hell's going on here, Hayes?" he demanded, his face flushed with the frustration of a man used to being in charge. Hayes met him with a calm that bordered on dismissive. "Sheriff, this is a federal matter now. You'll have your answers at the noon press briefing." Davis's jaw tightened, but he backed off, sensing the weight of something bigger than his small-town authority. By midday, the farm was a hive of activity. Military personnel set up communications equipment in Mark's kitchen, their radios crackling with coded messages that made the old wooden table look out of place. Outside, news vans lined the edge of the property, their antennas jutting into the sky like vultures circling a story. A carefully worded statement, delivered by a military spokesperson, announced that Mark Wilson had unknowingly played a pivotal role in a federal operation. His actions, sheltering a child tied to national security, were hailed as the epitome of selfless citizenship. The narrative shifted overnight. Grainy footage from Mark's own security camera, showing him trudging through the blizzard with Eli in his arms, aired on every major network. The same neighbors who'd turned their backs on him now swore they'd never believed the rumors, their voices dripping with false sincerity. As evening settled over the farm, the military presence remained, their silhouettes stark against the fading light. Mark sat alone on the porch, his thoughts a storm of gratitude and exhaustion. Agent Thornton, a man whose stoic demeanor had softened over the day, approached him quietly. "My son," Thornton began, his voice low, almost breaking. "He hasn't spoken since the attack. The trauma locked him inside himself. But this morning he spoke." Mark turned to meet Thornton's gaze, seeing the raw emotion in the man's eyes. "Do you know what he said?" His first words were, "Is the farmer safe?" Thornton's voice caught, and he looked away toward the barn where Eli and Jason were helping soldiers feed the livestock. "You carried him through that storm. You gave him warmth, clothes, safety, without asking for anything in return. That's why I fought to save your farm. Some debts, they can't be quantified." Mark's throat tightened, his eyes stinging as he followed Thornton's gaze. The boy's laughter drifted from the barn, a sound so pure it seemed to cut through the weight of the past weeks. He remembered the night he'd found Eli, the way the boy's silence had spoken louder than words, the way his small hand had gripped Mark's as they sat by the fire. He hadn't thought of himself as a hero, just a man doing what was right. As darkness fell, the townspeople began to arrive. They came in ones and twos, their faces shadowed with shame. They left flowers at the gate, their petals stark against the rusted metal, and slipped handwritten notes under the fence. Apologies scrawled in hasty, trembling hands. They lingered, awkward and silent, until the soldiers escorted them away. Mark watched it all, his heart a battleground of forgiveness and resentment. Then Eli approached, his steps tentative but his eyes clear. He took Mark's hand, his small fingers warm and steady. "You saved me," he said, each word deliberate, as if he were rediscovering how to speak. "Dad says you're a hero." Mark knelt to meet the boy's gaze, his knees creaking against the cold wood of the porch. "I'm just a farmer, Eli," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I did what anyone would have done." Eli shook his head, his expression carrying the unyielding wisdom of a child. "But they didn't. You did." The words landed like a stone in Mark's chest, stirring something he hadn't felt in years. Pride, not in himself, but in the truth of what he'd done. A month later, the farm was unrecognizable. The military had scaled back to occasional patrols, but their brief presence had left its mark. The barn stood stronger, its beams reinforced, its roof patched. New irrigation systems snaked through the fields, gleaming under the spring sun. The bank loan, that suffocating chain, had been paid off through an agricultural development grant, a polite fiction everyone understood as government compensation for Mark's unspoken role. He walked the fields now, Jason at his side, their footsteps lighter than they'd been in years. The land was theirs again, not just in deed, but in spirit. And though the town's apologies still felt hollow, Mark knew one truth. He'd made the right choice when no one else had. That was enough. Mark's life hadn't been touched by riches or fame, and he was content with that. His days still revolved around the steady, unyielding pulse of farm life, rising before dawn to tend to chores, planting seeds in spring, and gathering the harvest when autumn's chill settled over the fields. The rhythm of it all grounded him, a quiet comfort in the predictability of the earth's cycles. Every morning he saddled up his old mare and rode out to inspect the fields, his young son Jason at his side, his small face bright with curiosity and pride. Alongside them was Eli, a boy Mark had taken in as a foster son, while Agent Thornton, Eli's guardian, was away on a covert assignment. Mark's heart swelled with a quiet protectiveness for both boys, their laughter and chatter filling the crisp morning air as they bounced along the dirt paths, the fields stretching out like a patchwork quilt under the rising sun. Mark's thoughts often wandered as they rode, lingering on the weight of the past year. The community around him had shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, but profoundly. Where once his neighbors had kept their distance, their eyes averted, their voices silent, now they extended warm invitations to Sunday dinners, their tables laden with casseroles and fresh-baked pies. He could still feel the sting of those earlier days, the cold isolation when folks crossed the street to avoid him, their judgment hanging heavy in the air. It had hurt, that rejection, cutting deeper than he'd ever admit aloud. But now, those same farmers clapped him on the shoulder, their smiles genuine, their gratitude unspoken, but clear in their eyes. The school principal, a woman who had once treated Jason with barely concealed disdain, had come to their doorstep one evening, her voice trembling with regret as she apologized for her harshness. Mark had stood there listening, his heart caught between forgiveness and the lingering ache of her past actions. He'd nodded, accepting her words, but the memory of Jason's quiet tears after school still burned in his chest. Even Frank, the gruff neighbor who had once made a point of avoiding Mark, had surprised him one crisp fall morning. Frank arrived unannounced, his two sons in tow, their arms laden with tools and wire. Without a word, they set to work repairing a stretch of fencing that had sagged under the weight of time and weather. Mark had watched, stunned, as Frank's calloused hands worked alongside his own, the silence between them heavy with unspoken understanding. Frank's sons, lanky and earnest, laughed with Jason and Eli as they hammered posts into the ground, their camaraderie easing the tension in Mark's shoulders. He hadn't asked for their help, hadn't expected it, but the gesture stirred something deep within him, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could change. One morning, as Mark walked the boundary of his farm, he noticed a small wooden sign planted at the entrance, its carved words simple yet piercing. Here, a father chose courage over fear. No one claimed responsibility for it, and Mark didn't ask. He stood before it, his throat tight, his fingers brushing the rough grain of the wood. The sign felt like a quiet acknowledgement of the stand he'd taken, a stand that had cost him sleepless nights and the weight of a community's judgment. He thought about pulling it up, worried it might draw attention he didn't want, but in the end, he let it stand. It wasn't about pride, it was about truth. The sign was a reminder, not just to him, but to anyone who passed by, that doing what was right wasn't always loud or celebrated. It was often quiet, lonely, and hard. Agent Thornton's visits were rare, dictated by the strict security protocols of his work. But when he came, Mark felt a kinship with the man. On one such visit, Thornton found Mark kneeling in the field, his hands sifting through the soil to check the delicate wheat seedlings that had nearly been lost to a legal battle that had threatened to strip the farm from him. Mark's heart had raced in those days, fear gnawing at him as he imagined losing the land that had been his family's for generations. Now, as he brushed dirt from his hands, he felt a quiet triumph, the seedlings a testament to his refusal to give up. Thornton, his face weathered but kind, stood beside him, gazing out at the field. "The operation wraps up next month," he said, his voice steady but laced with something softer, almost vulnerable. "I've put in for a desk job after this. Eli needs stability, a real home." Mark glanced at the man, seeing the weight of his words. Thornton's eyes, usually sharp and guarded, softened as he spoke of Eli. The boy had been through too much, his young life marked by loss and uncertainty. Mark thought of Eli's shy smile, the way he'd begun to open up over the past months, his laughter mingling with Jason's as they raced through the fields. "He'll miss you when you take him back," Mark said, his voice low, the words catching in his throat. The thought of Eli leaving tugged at him, a pang of loss he hadn't expected. Thornton didn't respond right away. He stared at the horizon, the golden light catching the lines of his face, and Mark could sense the man wrestling with something deep within. "Actually," Thornton said finally, his voice quiet, "I was hoping he could stay here part-time. He's different with you, Mark. Happier. Healing. Truth be told, I think we both are." The admission hung between them, raw and unguarded. Mark felt a warmth spread through him, a mix of gratitude and responsibility. He nodded, unable to find words, but the agreement was sealed in the silence. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and fireflies began to flicker in the fields, Mark sat on the worn steps of his porch. The air was cool, carrying the scent of earth and gum, and the sound of Jason and Eli's laughter drifted to him as they darted through the twilight, chasing the glowing specks of light. Mark's chest ached with a quiet joy, a sense of purpose he hadn't known he could feel. The farm, once on the brink of being torn from him, now thrummed with life. New crops, new connections, new hope. The community that had once turned its back on him now held him up as an example. Their whispers of admiration both humbling and heavy. He didn't feel like a hero, didn't want the label. To him, it was simple. He'd seen suffering, Eli's, his community's, even his own. And he'd chosen to act, even when it meant standing alone. The cost had been high, the fear real, but he'd held fast. As he watched the boys, their silhouettes fading into the dusk, Mark's thoughts turned inward. He wondered why compassion, something so fundamental, so human, was often seen as extraordinary. The world, he realized, had a way of making kindness feel like a rebellion, a defiance against the current of indifference. He'd never set out to change anything, never sought to be anything more than a farmer, a father, a man who did what he believed was right. Yet, in that choice, he'd become something more. Not to himself, but to those who now looked to him with gratitude. The world might turn away, might falter, but justice, he believed, always found its way when you held on to what was right, no matter how long the wait. Some people, he thought, never set out to be heroes, but their quiet, steadfast actions could ripple outward, touching lives they'd never know, earning the quiet gratitude of a nation that needed reminding of what courage looked like.